All right, it's being recorded. Excellent. All right, well, thanks, John, for the invitation to present here, and thank you, everybody, for being interested in this topic. So I'm going to move through some slides that are part of a longer talk. So I'm going to jump around here, but just to start off, I'll motivate the topic a little bit, which I'm going to assume we don't necessarily need. I think most people are aware of the increasing relevance of wildfire, both on our ecosystems and on human livelihoods. So I'm coming to you from Missoula, which is up in the Northern Rockies. The University of Montana is here in the foreground, and this is a picture of the Lolo Peak fire, which was a large fire that burned just south of Missoula in 2017. And 2017 was in the Northern Rockies, was our last big regional fire year, and somewhat similar to what Colorado went through and much of the West went through last year in 2020. So, you know, last year was a record-setting fire season for a number of reasons, in part because of area burned. I'm going to move through here, but certainly because of human impacts. It had unprecedented impacts on humans, if only through exposure to smoke. And of course, dozens of lives lost across the West as well. Can I get a sense, Jonathan, participants here what's the geographic scope of everybody on?
You know, that's a great question. Perhaps we can have everybody in the chat. You say where you're from. It's already popping in right now. Can you see that, Phil?
I'll open it up here.
All right. We've got a good mix of West Coast, East Coast, Front Range folks. So we're all over the place.
Okay, that's helpful. Because I know some people are living with this in their backyard, and some people are seeing this on the news, and those experiences can be quite different. Okay, so yeah, I see a lot of Colorado. Okay, thanks. Okay, well, I'm going to purposefully move through this front end a little bit quick. So those of you in Colorado, you just went through a record-setting fire season last year, and this is part of a long-term trend of increasing fire activity over the last several decades. So 2020 kind of punctuates this trend of increasing area burned. This is across the Western US, varying, across the globe. Many ecosystems are also experiencing increasing fire activity, although not everywhere. That's an important point. So wildfire activity is increasing across the West. This is a very well quantified pattern. And in addition to that, so are the costs that we're putting into managing wildfires, which largely comes in the form of suppression. So there's a strong relationship here between the money that we spend on suppression and the total area burned. And that's coming at the cost of other important things that land managers are responsible for. And fires are increasingly becoming human disasters. So while I'm going to focus today on kind of forest responses to wildfires, part of the reason why this is in the public interest so much now is because fires are increasingly becoming human disasters, burning into human communities, and again, having both direct and indirect negative impacts on humans. So I like to start a lot of my talks just pointing out that fire itself is not the problem, because on our planet, fire is a long-standing natural process. It's been around basically for as long as we've had plants living on the land. So as long as there's been carbon fixed by plants on the land and enough oxygen in our atmosphere, we've had fire as part of our planet. So that's about 420 million years is the evidence that we have for how long fire has been part of our ecosystems. And humans, we've evolved closely with the use of fire, both for cooking and for changing landscapes, modifying landscapes in ways that have been useful for us. So part of the challenge of this topic is holding both of these things at the same time, that fire is both this natural phenomenon that's really a critical part of many ecosystems, particularly forest ecosystems in the West. And at the other end of the spectrum here, it can be and is increasingly becoming a human disaster. So this is a little bit oversimplified, but basically, we can't move to either end of this spectrum. We can't say that fire is just a natural disaster that we need to get rid of. If we've tried that, it doesn't work. And also, if we do that, we're going to be losing a lot of the things that we come to expect from forest ecosystems. And on the other end of the spectrum, we can't just understand fire as a natural process and something that we can simply let burn without being managed. Okay, so I'm going to briefly touch on why fire activity is increasing, and then I'm going to move into the ecological impacts and touch a little bit on the paper, the case study that you'll be focusing on in the next section, and then a little bit about what we can expect for the future. And I will probably skip this "what can we do" part, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. So I started with that figure showing increased wildfire activity across the West over the past several decades. An overarching driver of the increased fire activity that we've seen in recent decades is climate change, and in particular, the type of weather and climate that we are experiencing this summer, right? Increasingly warm, dry conditions, characterized as drought in many cases, which lead to longer fire seasons and drier vegetation on the landscape. That is well linked with increased area burned over individual fire seasons and increased area burned over years to decades and longer, centuries, in a lot of the work that I do looking at fire history over thousands of years. So widespread forest fire activity is strongly linked to warm, dry seasonal conditions, and this is true across multiple timescales. So years, well, weeks, months, years, decades, and even millennia. This is my most animated animation, and every year this is a little bit more out of date, but there are dozens of studies that support this link between climate and wildfire activity. And just last week, we had a paper that came out that helped put the Colorado fire season, the 2020 fire season, in context. And it again emphasizes this important link between climate and fire activity. Now, I have in the lower left here an important asterisk, right? This does not mean that humans and changes in vegetation are not important, right? Humans are really important modifiers of when, where, and how fire burns, as is the way that we've managed or not managed landscapes in the past. But one of the reasons why I emphasize climate so much is because climate enables large fires to occur by drying out fuels. So it's not the only ingredient needed, but when we have widespread warm, dry conditions, that's kind of the first step that's needed to enable the possibility of really extensive fire seasons like 2020. So 2020 is a great example of how climate enables widespread fire activity. And giving this talk today in late June, I mean, frankly, I'm a little bit scared. to see what is going to happen over 2021, because these conditions are either similar or even more amplified as we move into the 2021 fire season, which is already active across large portions of the West. So from the science perspective, the relationship between climate and wildfire activity is quite strong. And in retrospect, it's easy for us to explain why we have these extensive fire seasons. To go back one slide here a little bit, what I'm showing on the left here, this term VPD, this is a little bit jargony. It stands for vapor pressure deficit, but essentially it reflects how thirsty the atmosphere is. So the higher the vapor pressure deficit is, the more moisture the atmosphere will suck out of both live plants and dead plant material. So it is a useful measure of how dry fuels become, and the drier the fuels, the more susceptible they are to fire ignition and spread. So this is the relationship between vapor pressure deficit and area burned across the West from 1984 to 2020. And this only goes through September 2020, so it doesn't include, for example, the East Troublesome Fire in Colorado. So there was some burning that occurred after this. But basically 2020, falls right along this relationship between increasing vapor pressure deficit, so warm and dry on the right, cooler and wetter on the left, and total amount of area burned across the West. So for better or for worse, we kind of know as our summers become warmer and drier, we're going to end up with more dots up here. And again, it looks like 2021 is probably, we're poised to put another dot up here in this part of the quadrant. Human-caused climate change is an important contributor to recent wildfire activity. We can ignore the graph here for now, but this is an important paper from a couple of years ago. And the key conclusion from this work is that these authors, John Abotsoglu and Parks Williams, were able to attribute the degree to which recent increases in fire activity across the West were due to human-caused climate change. So their conclusion here, anthropogenic climate change accounts for around half of the total forest area burned from 1984 to 2015. So this is an additional challenge on top of that, natural phenomenon, human disaster spectrum, right? This is about, 50-50. So you can kind of look at this as glass half full, glass half empty. What this means is that, on average, every fire that we see out there increasingly has the fingerprint of human-caused climate change on it. At the same time, we know that fire is a long-standing natural process in these ecosystems. So the flip side of that is we can't also say, we can't look at a fire and say that this fire is only because of climate change. So we really have this melding of human and non-human causes mixing to drive wildfire activity. And then here are some of the other factors, right, that are important. We know that in particular forests, fire suppression has been an important driver of recent changes in fire activity, particularly in low elevation forests and mixed elevation forests. Okay, I'm going to bounce out a little bit, skip some stuff, and what I want to highlight here is the impacts, ecological impacts of wildfires on our forests. So how do we understand how fires are impacting forests, and how do we think about how our forests are going to change due to this combination of both increasing fire activity and, importantly, changes in climate, such that the trees that are regenerating after these fires are experiencing conditions that are different than 50, 100, a couple hundred years ago. So one thing that we do when we think about the ecological impacts of fire is that we stratify this based on the characteristic pattern of fire in ecosystems in the past. And the term we use to characterize that is the fire regime. And in essence, we take what is a really complex process and boil it down into these three kind of simple categories: a low severity fire regime, mixed severity fire regime, or a high severity fire regime. And at the simplest level, this low, mixed, and high severity refers to, at least from the perspective of forests, of how many trees we'd expect to be killed. So in a low severity fire regime, like the photo on the right, we'd expect fire to creep through the surface of the forest, and most of the trees will survive that fire due to a variety of traits that they have, like thick bark that insulates the living cambium from the heat of the fire. On the other end, in a high severity fire regime, which is what we see in high elevation forests, we expect most of the trees to be killed by fire. So what are dramatic looking photos to us are more or less business as usual for these forests that burn in high severity fire regimes. Really importantly, each fire burns with a mix of these severities at any location. So those of you in Colorado, you probably saw photos like this or images like this on the TV screen last summer. Oftentimes fire is portrayed as, you know, destroying everything within the perimeter or consuming everything within the perimeter. Right? That's not the way fire works. It burns really patchily or with a lot of variability. So this is an image of that fire that was on my title slide. And in essence, these colors represent, to a degree, the amount of trees killed, where the red, we'd expect to see most of the trees killed, and the green here, the dark green, are areas where there was very little fire or no fire. Looking at a similar image, this is from satellites. This is the way that satellites see changes in greenness from space. Similar image for the East Troublesome Fire, one of the large fires that burned in Colorado last year, has a similar level of patchiness and variability. Okay, I see I'm at 17 minutes, so I'm gonna move past this. In general, when we study fire history in the past, we see really a remarkable ability for ecosystems to recover from even these high severity fires. And the 1988 fires in Yellowstone are perhaps, you know, one of the best recent examples of this. There are many examples across the West, but the Yellowstone fires are kind of iconic. So this is a satellite image of Yellowstone National Park. You've been there. This is the this is Gardner up here. This is Yellowstone Lake. And you can see approximately 20 years after the 88 fires, much of those forests are well on their way to recovering. So forests are remarkably resilient to even high severity fire. And we know this from fire history studies showing that forests have recovered to multiple high severity fires over thousands of years. I'm gonna skip these slides and move into this more recent post-fire recovery. So the story from Yellowstone, you know, we also see that after many fires that have burned in the late 20th and early 21st century. This is a study from a former PhD student, Carrie Kemp, that basically went out to areas that burned over the last several decades and searched for seedlings. And this is similar to the methods that were used in the paper that you guys are going to be diving into. And in fact, these data are part of the data set that goes into that paper. So, you know, earlier I referred to this glass half full, half empty concept. There are a lot of forests where trees are regenerating. But what we are starting to see is that in some forests, tree regeneration after wildfires is decreasing. And what we think this represents is this response to warming climate and, to a degree, somewhat changes in the way that fire is burning. but probably mostly at this point, a warming climate. So this resilience, this longstanding resilience that forests have shown is starting to erode. And in essence, this is because seedlings are particularly sensitive to climate conditions in the first 1 to several years that of their lives. They have small roots, so they can't reach down and get water that older trees can get. And actually, they haven't developed bark yet, so they are actually susceptible to being girdled by warm temperatures. And sun on a black, recently burned landscape can be warm enough to do that. Okay, I'm going to skip these and highlight the paper that you guys are reading. So, or that this activity is based on. So in this paper, led by Camille Stevens-Ruman, who's a professor at Colorado State University, what Camille and co-authors here, what we did was we looked at data from across the Rocky Mountains, so from Colorado up into Montana and Idaho and a little bit of Washington. And we went out, mainly Camille, Carrie, Brian, Harvey, the graduate students here. They went out to all of these sites and searched for seedlings, quantified revegetation after these fires. And we compared that then to climate in the period after these fires. And in particularly, we contrasted forest regeneration in the 21st century to forest regeneration in the late 20th century. And it just so happens that one of the most distinct changes in our climate happened around the turn of the 21st century, around 2000. So this is a figure from the paper. On the y-axis here, this is water deficit. So in a way, this is similar to that vapor pressure deficit. It's reflecting the need for water that a plant might experience. So high water deficit is basically reflecting warm, dry conditions, and low water deficit, cool, wet conditions. And you can see this trend of increasing water deficit over this time period. And when we look, and I guess distinctly here, the 21st century has a distinctly higher water deficit than the last equal time period in the 20th century. So what we found in this paper was this evidence for reduced post-fire tree regeneration in the 21st century. And we highlight that in a couple of ways. The top row here, these are the patterns before 2000, so in the late 20th century. And in the bottom row here, these are the patterns since 2000. So on the left, this is the climate, our characterization of climate in the 3 years after the fire occurred. We focus on 3 years because that's a really important window for trees to establish after wildfire. 3, 4, 5, we could really choose any of those, but basically the first couple of years after a wildfire. And then on the right here, this is literally the density of tree seedlings that we found at these sites. So tree density, number per hectare. And what we see as we transition from the late 20th to the early 21st century is that our climate conditions are becoming warmer and drier, have become warmer and drier after these wildfires. And correspondingly, we see a shift towards less tree regeneration and more sites that had no seedlings, no tree regeneration after wildfire. And I think, I don't have the figure in here, but another figure in the paper that you'll see, in essence, we found, somewhere around half of the sites in the 21st century were experiencing reduced tree regeneration. So again, it's not that all sites are failing to regenerate. It's about half of the sites are. I'll touch on this and then I want to open it up to questions. because I expect folks have a lot of questions, and maybe we can dip back into the slides. Research since that paper that you guys are going to be focusing on, led by Kim Davis here, has really helped us understand kind of the reason that we're seeing reduced tree regeneration. And in this paper, what is highlighted is how the specific climate conditions that trees require for regeneration after wildfires, and how that shift that we saw in climate from the late 20th to the early 21st century, how that is impacting tree regeneration and leading to fewer trees regenerating. So it's well linked conceptually, but this paper really kind of flushes out the mechanisms of how climate impacts tree regeneration. And it uses all of those sites, or many of the sites that are included in that paper that we were just looking at and that you'll look at in more detail, and it adds on sites from the Southern Rockies and California in that. Okay, I want to stop there, and I can share again if as needed, but I'm hoping that we can have more of a conversation here.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That was really great, and a really great introduction to that 2017 paper that we'll dive into in more detail after lunch. There's already a couple questions that have popped up in the chat, and I would encourage you all to either post your questions in the chat or feel free to hop on and say your question aloud. But we'll go with the first one here, Phil. Regarding Yellowstone, is recovery related to human mitigation after the fact?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and a really important one. So no, recovery in Yellowstone is not due to human mitigation. So Yellowstone is a great, literally a textbook example of how forests have evolved to exist with high severity fire. And one of the trees that dominates in Yellowstone, lodgepole pine, it has cones that don't open up and they won't release their seed until they're heated up by wildfire. So in part, what makes the forests in Yellowstone so resilient to wildfire, and by resilience here, I literally mean, the ability to bounce back, to return to a condition similar to before the wildfire. What makes those forests so resilient are those serotinous cones on those trees. And I teach fire ecology to undergraduate students, but I think this exercise would be a great exercise for any student from middle school to high school. If you're in the West and you can find some serotinous cones from lodgepole pine, a great demonstration of this trait is to be able to take those and, with a camp stove or a blowtorch, you can heat them up. You'll see them open up, and then you can tap them and the seeds will fall out. So kind of a long answer, getting a little bit away, but in general, the reason that those forests are able to regenerate without any planting is because of those serotinous cones. And you see that it's not unique to Yellowstone. You see that across much of the West.
And Phil, I wanted to just kind of run a thread, kind of riffing off that. We'll get to Jennifer and Gwen, your question after this. I wanted to just think, are there any active steps you can take to support forest recovery?
Yeah, so I'll keep going on this, on the thread. So places where there was lodgepole pine, for example, that tree, it has a great ability to regenerate. And for example, in portions of that Lolo Peak fire, which was in the background when we started, I visited there every year, and I was just up there in May, and there's a carpet of lodgepole pine coming up. The seedlings are about a half foot or so tall, so they're doing great. The places where managers can step in and assist in regeneration are places where the trees don't have serotinous cones. And so there are a lot of trees that don't have serotinous cones. I'll just name a few. So Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, those are ones you'll see in high elevations across the Rockies. At lower elevations, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, western larch, they don't have serotinous cones. So if there's a big patch, remember that image that I showed, the satellite image, if there's a big patch of red, a big area where all the trees are killed and there's no serotinous species there, then regeneration depends on how far away you are from a seed source. And that's mentioned a little bit in the paper, because that's kind of, in the absence of lodgepole pine's really special adaptation, the distance to a seed source is the #1 predictor of whether or not you're going to see a seedling at a site after a fire or not. So one place where managers have the ability to speed up recovery or assist in recovery is to do planting in those areas that are far away from a seed source. And by far away here, we mean roughly 300 feet. So if you're roughly more than 300 feet away from a live tree that could have a seed disperse into a burned area, it's going to take a lot longer for the forest to regenerate there.
Great. And then maybe we can pop into Gwen's question about, your thoughts on how to educate climate change deniers, skeptics about how to understand the human impact. And some others have a similar question.
Yeah, that's of course a great question. I'm gonna take this from a high level. I think it's pretty clear that somebody who is a climate change denier, it's pretty clear that showering them with information, showering them with facts is not going to change their mind. I think the research and experience is showing increasingly that the way to have people change their opinion on a topic is to link it to something that they value or love. So for better or for worse, I think, as the impacts of climate change diversify and accumulate, there are more and more opportunities to be able to have the conversation about climate change with somebody and link it to what they care about. So, from the perspective of wildfire and forests, certainly, the pervasive impacts of wildfire smoke, and I see people in here noting that you're waking up to smoke this morning, right? Like those pervasive impacts are one way to connect with people. Like if you don't want to have to plan your summer vacation around, what's burning in July and August, then it behooves you to recognize the impact of climate change on increasing wildfire activity. So big picture, it's linking to things that you care about, and then maybe you could follow it up with some of the research. The patterns in themselves speak for themselves in terms of increasing temperatures, increasing fire activity, and in a way, it's kind of, well, I guess increasingly fewer people are denying that things are changing because we're experiencing it and observing it. From there, I guess you just ask the question: do we want to change this or not? And if we want to change this or affect this, then let's just look at what most of the world thinks the cause is.
Great. And Tara, I see your hands up. Would you like to share your question?
Yeah, I would love to. I feel like last year maybe, and I don't know that much about it, but I felt like there was this movement from people, I don't know if it was kind of like in the tech industry or what it was, but it was about like this 1 trillion trees, and if we plant, so many trees, then that will reduce climate change. And I would just love to hear your perspective as a forest ecologist on that. And I don't know if you'd ever even heard of that movement recently and what you think about it.
Yeah, Tara, that's a great question. Yes, I have heard of that, the Million or Trillion Tree Initiative, and more broadly, planting trees is being promoted as an important way to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And just it starts from a very simple perspective, right? One that we learned in high school biology, right? With photosynthesis. Well, if plants are fixing carbon from the atmosphere, one way that we can take out CO2 from the atmosphere is to plant more plants, plant more trees, and have them fix carbon. So it kind of, it makes sense at that level, but not surprisingly, there's a lot of devil in the details. So really broadly, I guess I have two perspectives, or two overall points. I'm a little bit cautious or hesitant, as are many climate scientists, about that conversation kind of distracting from really the best thing we can do to mitigate climate change is to stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. We need to be doing a lot of things at the same time. So, forests as carbon sinks are really important, and that has to be on our radar. But we can't. It doesn't behoove us to start planting trees everywhere for a couple reasons. One, part of the increase in fire activity and changes in fire behavior in low elevation forests is because we have too many trees in there relative to how these systems have behaved and functioned in the past. And so in that sense, planting trees across the West, for example, is going to work in direct opposition of helping make communities safer from wildfires, for example. And then increasingly, because climate is changing, some efforts are looking out there and saying, well, where's climate suitable for trees? And they're using climate from the last 30 years. And in a lot of those areas, if we tried to plant trees there, that those trees are unlikely to survive in the warmest, driest areas for the upcoming decades. So it's good to have a bit of skepticism when reading about or studying the potential role of forests for acting as increased carbon sinks.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I'm going to kind of synthesize a couple of questions and bring it into one. Perhaps there are questions about, thinning practices and how more fuels affect fire regimes and what thinning could do to change fire regimes, and also questions about the human fingerprint and whether CO2 greenhouse gases are impacting different fires. So I was wondering if perhaps you could go back to that figure in your slide from that paper that showed the human fingerprint, and speak a little bit to how we know it's the complexities around management practices and climate and fire.
Okay. Yeah, I have two slides then that I will share here to speak to these.
Thanks. And then we'll get to you after this. Thanks for raising your hand.
Okay, I lost my video, but do you see?
We got you. Yep.
Okay, so this is the slide. This was the first study, but there are now a number of studies since this study that were able to tease out the influence of human-caused climate change. And when we say human-caused climate change, we really, in essence, that is climate change that is due to the increase in greenhouse gases, largely from fossil fuel combustion. So what these authors did was they were able to, using global climate models that are run retrospectively in the past, we can run the global climate model with and without the increased contribution of greenhouse gases from anthropogenic sources. So again, mainly CO2 from fossil fuel combustion. So we have an idea of what temperature and precipitation would be like if we didn't run this grand experiment that we're running of human-caused climate change. And what this is showing, in essence, this is the same graph of increased area burned, but it is cumulative. So this is cumulative forest area burned across the West from 1984 here to 2015. And the red line is what we've observed. So this is, you know, the increase in fire activity that we've observed. And the black line here, this is what they expect in the absence of human-caused climate change. So this ACC means anthropogenic climate change. And then the yellow line is just the difference there. And it turns out that these two are about the same because the contribution of human-caused climate change is about half. So we know that human-caused climate change, mainly through CO2 in the atmosphere and the warming that comes from that, has made forests more susceptible to burning, and that can account for about half of the total area burned over the last several decades. So
thanks, Phil. Yeah, and I think, you know, to your point, you spoke a lot about this, Phil. The warming temperatures increasing the atmospheric thirst and drawing more water from soils, from plants, both dead and alive, drying out those fuels and increasing these fires in different ways. So I think that hopefully that answers a couple of the questions that were in the chat there. Wehunt, you want to unmute yourself and share your question, please?
Yeah, simple question. I know this has been politicized. I care less about that. Is a debate on whether or not to clean debris from the forest floor to reduce fire. My question really is, what's the impact from removing the debris? Because I know there's an argument whether remove the debris or leave it, and the fires have had possibly been hotter because there's more fuel to burn. But what would be the impact of removing the debris on the forest recovery?
okay, yeah, that's a great question. Let's see. I'll start with a direct answer, but I do want to share some slides on this more general question of fuel breaks and how, if and how that affects fire activity. Yeah, how does thinning affect fire behavior was the general question in there. So first off, the general answer is those impacts will vary depending on the type of forest that you're in. And broadly, you can think about this as these high elevation forests, low elevation forests, and then the forests in between. In low elevation forests, removing fuels, if done well, will have minimal negative impacts on a forest. One thing that's important to point out, you know, in the conversation, we hear the term forest management thrown around, right? That can mean a lot of different things. So a timber sale or extracting trees for the purpose of commercial timber, you know, that doesn't have the same goal as a fuels treatment that has the goal of reducing fire hazard. So the impacts can vary quite a bit depending on how the vegetation management is done. One thing that is really clear, particularly in these low elevation forests, is that after trees are removed or vegetation is removed, it's really important to have prescribed fire applied to the stands. And the reason that's important is because the prescribed fire is kind of the most efficient and in many cases the only way that you can consume and get rid of what we call fine fuels, which are basically, think of pine needles or grasses, long skinny vegetation that's hard to remove with machinery, and small twigs and things. So after trees are removed, often there are a lot of small twigs and branches that end up on the forest floor. If you were to just walk away at that point, then you could be leaving that forest in a more vulnerable position than it was before. Provided that you treat those fine fuels with a prescribed fire, for example, then that forest will be, when it burns, it will be less likely to have that fire move from the forest floor to the crowns of the trees. So
Thanks, Phil. And then we'll have Sherry's question be the last one. Do you see that in the chat there? Or I can, a little bit about your work extracting lake sediments, using those to reconstruct fires.
sure, yeah. There's a lot potentially in there. Here, I'll just share this. This is the, and I know I'm not sharing yet, but okay, this is the quick and dirty answer to that. So the way that we learn about how these ecosystems have changed in the past is we collect lake cores. So basically this is the mud at the bottom of a lake. We use relatively small lakes, and in essence, as you go down in a lake sediment core, you're going back in time. So in essence, they work kind of like tree rings. Going down, you're going back in time. And because these lakes accumulate sediment continuously, we get a continuous record of what's happened, not only in the lake, but what we're interested in is what's happened surrounding the lake. So we collect these cores. So this water here is the bottom of the lake. This is in like 45 feet of water. And this is the distinct transition between water and mud. And in the lab, we slice these up into half-centimeter little slices. And in each one of those slices, we can look at a variety of things. We can look at pollen to learn how the vegetation has changed, or tree needles. And then to reconstruct fires, we look at what we call macroscopic charcoal. So relatively big pieces of charcoal. And we put this together through multiple cores, and we can go back thousands of years in time, and we interpret the variability in a variety of these proxies, in essence, to put together our understanding of how an ecosystem has changed in the past.
That's awesome. Phil, thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with us and to answer these questions. I've been recording this. This is going to be a really valuable resource for me and hopefully for others here. And so thank you so much for that. This has been great.
You're welcome. And yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions if folks have questions. So I see that there's some that we're not going to be able to get to. So you can share my email, and I'm happy to answer questions. And also, if you want to brainstorm or have ideas for things that you can do with your classes, I'm happy to have ideas bounce off, or if you have questions, point you in a direction. So
great, I appreciate that. I think what we can do is we'll share this video, share your email address, and then do that as needed. But really appreciate your help with this. It's fantastic.
All right, and thank you everybody for all the work that you do.
Thanks, Phil. And so the rest of us, what we're going to do, let's take 30. Get out, go have your lunch, stretch your legs. I'll start a timer here in Google and share my screen. And when we come back, we'll dive into that case study and talk a little bit more about how you can incorporate Phil's work and this contemporary research into your classroom. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, John, I will share